Hello and what is up YouTube? My name is G3Iron and today we are going to be dissecting some of the various inputs and outputs that might weigh on you when you are making a decision whether or not you ought to use the elemental overload keystone. In other words, we're going to be factoring in when is it better to scale up your crit strike multiplier, or when is it better to grab a 40% more multiplier on elemental damage via expenditure of passives on the passive tree using elemental overload. If at any point in time you'd like to encourage the channel for more videos just like this one, you can go ahead, like, subscribe, and ding the bell. Those of you who are veterans of the channel, you know that there are timestamps placed above my slightly balding forehead for your convenience, and those are hot linked down below in the video description. So that way, if at any point in time you'd like to revisit any of our topics today, or you'd like to jump ahead, you can do so at your convenience. Of course, there's all kinds of details about how you can join our Discord for various discussions just like this one, only via Discord text chat, as well as a link to support our Patreon if you'd like to do that. Moving on today to talk about finding the balance. That's really what this entire discussion boils down to. If you walk away from today's discussion with nothing except this, I will feel like this has been a successful discussion for us all as a community. The finding the balance elements of this particular discussion around elemental overload is simply found out whether or not it is better for your build to scale up your damage via global critical strike multiplier, or simply GCSM for short, or to use elemental overload, or EO for short. There are going to be times when elemental overload is going to be a much cheaper, in other words, less expensive via currency option for scaling your damage via critical strike multiplier. But there's also going to be times when elemental overload, or EO, is going to be too expensive. Maybe it's too many passive points for your particular build to get to. And so therefore, it's better for you to scale your damage via global critical strike multiplier. There's lots of different builds out there in the wonderful world and wonderful meta that we are presently in 3.8 Blight League. And so while some of you might be coming to this and just saying, well, is elemental overload better than critical strike? The answer is, it depends, and there's a couple of factors, and we're going to be digging into that. So, like many mechanics in PoE, EO is an option that finds its best benefit in the mix of the costs associated with activating elemental overload. This cost is then balanced and compared with the cost associated with scaling up your critical strike multiplier. If all of that sounds way too confusing, it can be boiled down to simply this: finding the balance in which does more damage for less price. It's just that simple. It really is an issue of economics and scalability of your own build and your own damage sources. So there is the iron price, that you might call it, for acquiring elemental overload through passives on the passive tree. Different character classes have different starting locations on the passive tree, and so of course different classes have got either higher prices to pay to go up and grab elemental overload, or they've got fewer prices to pay, and therefore it's easier for them to grab. So starting at the top of the tree, the Witch and the Templar are the easiest and closest to grabbing elemental overload if you simply use the least amount of points possible to rush getting to elemental overload. The Shadow and the Scion then come in at the next two cheapest with either 13 points or 16 points respectively. Then the Marauder at 19 points is pretty far away from elemental overload, and the Duelist and the Ranger are both tied at the most expensive spots on the tree, being 22 points apiece. Depending on which class it is that you are playing, elemental overload is going to cost you more passives to get to. So when you're building a tree out and considering elemental overload as an option for scaling your damage, you might not only want to consider which ascendancy you're playing. Of course, that's always a factor whenever we're selecting a build in Path of Exile, but you might really want to hone in on which of these classes it is that you're going to choose and what sort of passive points you've got available to you based on the classes that you choose. If you choose a Templar or a Witch, it might be that you're already spending a lot of your passive points up near the top left-hand side of the tree anyway, and therefore it's easy for you to grab elemental overload. Whereas if you choose a Duelist or a Ranger as one of your base classes, and then maybe an ascendancy that's associated with that as the pigeonhole or as the option that you feel like your build is going in that direction, direction, well, it's going to cost you a bunch of points to get up to go grab Elemental Overload. That doesn't mean that you can't grab it on a duelist or on a ranger. It just means that you're going to have to find ways to make those 22 points valuable and effective for your build. Taking a look at Global Critical Strike Multiplier and its impact, this is simply a heat map observation of what the present 3.8 passive tree looks like right now with a search for Critical Strike Multiplier on the tree. You can see that there are some ascendancies that have got some Critical Strike multipliers. Of course, the Assassin just got an update. He's got some Critical Strike multi on him. You've also got the Saboteur that has got some Critical Strike multiplier on him. Of course, you've also got on the opposite side of the tree the Inquisitor that's got a bunch of different Critical Strike options. So choosing your class wisely is going to be something to consider. If you are choosing a class like, let's say, a Marauder, it might be very far away from you to go grab Elemental Overload at several points to travel all the way up to that top left side of the tree. However, since you're scaling up and going up to grab Elemental Overload, it might actually be less points for you, even though it is far away, to scale up your Elemental Overload than it is for you to scale Critical Strike Multiplier on the tree, because that might actually be even further from the rest of your goals in the top half of the tree, since that's where most of the Critical Strike Multiplier is located, either on the top half or on the right-hand side of the tree, which makes it tough for a Marauder to go grab it. So at first glance, you might say, Marauder? Why would a Marauder ever go grab Elemental Overload? Well, not necessarily because the distance to Elemental Overload isn't great. It is great, but the distance for even more Critical Strike Multiplier effective and efficient nodes is even higher than going and grabbing Elemental Overload. Continuing on, there's a second way to scale your Global Critical Strike Multiplier, and that is through itemization. You can, of course, get tier 1 rolls on various item slots. All of these numbers were created via our PoE itemization project that we're working on. For those of you that have been interested in that, I'm still working on it. It's still going great. I love it, and it gives me a tool and an outlet for doing this kind of research and this kind of comparison. Simply put, we've got tier 1 rolls for Global Critical Strike Multiplier. Rings and amulets can both get 17 to 20%. Two-handed weapons and one-handed weapons and quivers as well can all roll 35 to 38%. Shields cannot roll Global Critical Strike Multiplier. Of course, there are other Critical Strike sources out there other than just Global Critical Strike Multiplier. There's Critical Strike Multiplier for spells, there's Critical Strike Multiplier for weapons, for attacks. So there's lots of different ways to scale up your Global Critical Strike Multiplier across the board, and then you can specialize it from there. This is simply one example. As you're taking a look, there are not options, for instance, on this specific stat in the helm, in the chest piece, in the gloves, on belts, or on boots. Of course, in the belt slot, you could go with something like Global Critical Strike Multiplier effect while you have a flask that's rolling. And of course, you've got other options as well, like in the glove slot, like socketed spells or socketed attacks are supported by various aspects and levels of Critical Strike Multiplier. So there's lots of ways to work around this, but this just gives you a comparison point. If you are going to scale up your Critical Strike Multiplier, there are definitely going to be some item slots that you're really going to look for this tier 1 roll, and maybe some other item slots that you're not going to care about this as a particularly top tier roll, because it's not going to scale very well for you, if at all. So itemization is another factor when you are considering whether or not Elemental Overload is going to be worth it for your build, or scaling Critical Strike Multiplier is better for your build. Speaking of which is better, there is a wonderfully helpful chart that is available on the wiki, and that is, of course, linked down below in the video description for your viewing pleasure. It is awkwardly displayed here. Those of you that are dropping me a comment and letting me know that it's very, very teeny and very, very small, I get it. I get it. The reality is that this particular chart is incredibly helpful for understanding what thresholds you need to hit for your Global Critical Strike versus your effective Critical Strike chance. So in other words, if Elemental Overload actually procs every 8 seconds or so since you're critically striking, how many times do you need to be attacking in order to effectively critically strike every 8 seconds or so in order to keep up Elemental Overload on a consistent basis? Then compare those numbers of your effective critical strike chance versus the damage that you would get from a Critical Strike Multiplier being higher in its effective damage over elemental overload simply being kept up for a threshold of 8 seconds reliably. And you can see here that at 15% effective critical strike chance, that includes your accuracy. It's essentially saying, hey, you've got a 15% chance to actually critically strike every single time that you are attacking. This is including accuracy and misses and dodges and that sort of thing, and factoring in whether or not minions are evading or actually dodging your attacks. So at 15%, you need to have 370 crit multi in order for that percentage of critical strike chance to be better than simply taking the elemental overload threshold in terms of its damage multiplier. We're not talking about passive points here or the cost of it. That's something that we've already addressed a little bit previously. This is simply saying, in order to get the same bang for your buck damage-wise, these are the thresholds that you need to hit. If you've got 30% effective critical chance to hit, you'll need only 240% critical strike multiplier for your damage to be better. That means at 239%, it's actually better for you to be using elemental overload than it is for you to be using critical strike multi. At 45%, 190% is the threshold. At 60%, 170 is the threshold. And at 75%, 160 is the threshold. You can actually see that there's some severe diminishing returns on global critical strike multi, the more chance you have to actually effectively critically strike. So those are something else to balance entirely, but it is something to keep in mind that there is a threshold where it's simply not worth investing that much more of your actual effective critical strike chance into, but rather there's kind of this sweet spot right around 30% where you can effectively scale up at a cheap rate your global critical strike multiplier along with your critical strike chance, and you get to a happy medium where you've got a relatively cheap build that's still better than spending points on elemental overload. Consequently, if you're nowhere near any of these particular nodes to get you critical strike multiplier, or you simply don't want to itemize into that, or maybe you're playing SSF and you haven't been able to find any items or craft any items that really have good juicy numbers for critical strike multiplier, then you might want to consider elemental overload because it'll actually be better for your build according to these thresholds and calculations. So there are a couple reasons why you would never use elemental overload, and those reasons are a few, just to mention the top couple. First off, if you are playing a build that utilizes Perfect Agony in any way, which Perfect Agony is a keystone on the passive tree that reads, modifiers to critical strike multiplier also apply to damage over time multiplier for ailments from critical strikes at 50% of their value. If you take Perfect Agony, you won't be doing any critical strikes if you also take elemental overload. Like, you just don't get the benefits of these things. They cancel one another out. And so the same is true for brutality, but in a little bit of a different way. Brutality says that you deal no elemental damage. So taking elemental overload, which gives you 40% more elemental damage, is going to have no effect for your build. You're effectively canceling one another out. Brutality and elemental overload would not go together. And then, of course, ailment builds. Since ailment builds often rely on critical strikes and critical strike multipliers in order to scale up damage and effect off of various ailments, if you're an ailment build, chances are you're not going to be using elemental overload. There are a few exceptions to that, but that's the general rule of thumb. So what is the best balance for your particular build? Well, a couple of steps that you can run through in order to check what the best balance is. So first off, you're going to want to check your effective critical strike chance and weigh it against your critical strike multiplier. Essentially, you're going to want to check the chart that we've referenced down below in the video description and check and see where is your build on that chart. What's your effective critical strike chance and how does it weigh against your critical strike multiplier? Are you reaching a threshold where your critical strike multiplier is dealing more damage than simply having 40% more elemental damage up on a relatively regular basis, since you're going to be critting at a relatively regular clip over 8 seconds, keeping EO sustained? Secondly, you're going to want to check how many passive points would it take for you to include elemental overload in your build. Is it going to be something that maybe isn't that far out of your way, and so it's just a few passive points to go grab it? I have one quick story on this. There are 2 players inside our G3 guild in PoE that have come to me at different points throughout their PoE career and said, hey Iron, can you take a look at our passive trees and help us improve our builds? Both of them are wonderful, wonderful players, and they're always creative and always looking for feedback. took a second to look at their POBs, did two quick things right away. First off, I simply deleted the top right half of their tree that was scaling up critical strike multiplier, and I simply went and for a few passive points took elemental overload. On one of the builds, I remember we saved about 20, I think it was 20 or 22 points that we actually saved from going up and around and grabbing a whole bunch of critical strike multiplier. We grabbed elemental overload instead. He ended up losing a smidgen of damage, just a smidgen of damage, not much at all. And as soon as we swapped over some of his flasks in order to keep his critical strike chance up, in order for that way his critical strike hits were lucky, and then switched around a couple of other items in order to get his critical strike chance up, his damage actually ended up dealing more damage for, I think it was, again, like 20 or 22 points less spent on the passive tree, which essentially enabled him to then revamp the rest of his build and go, wow, I can go grab jewel slots on the passive tree. I can go grab extra life on the passive tree that I otherwise wasn't grabbing. I can go and grab a couple more keynotes that I otherwise would have wanted to get but couldn't get. All of those became options for him because he was able to then play with essentially 20 to 22 new passives that he otherwise would not have had available to him because he swapped over from scaling his critical strike multiplier to scaling up his elemental overload damage. So check how many passive points it would take for you to go grab EO versus grabbing similar points for similar damage scaling critical strike multiplier. Then lastly, what you're going to want to check is what items you would need to upgrade or craft or purchase for yourself if you were to go from EO to scaling critical strike multiplier. One thing that I will say as a general rule of thumb, as we're talking about balance and playing on that teeter-totter of choosing critical strike multiplier or choosing elemental overload, is that the general rule is if you can actually craft or purchase a bunch of items and a bunch of passive points that are scaled into critical strike multiplier, you're going to do way more damage than if you were to scale up with elemental overload. In general, critical strike multiplier is going to give you much higher top end damage than elemental overload is going to give you. However, elemental overload can be a more budget version of scaling up your damage and save you passive points as well as save you currency from crafting very, very expensive and sometimes tough to craft upgrades that are much needed if you're going to hit the top end of the damage that's capable of being produced by a crit scaling build. So those are some of our thoughts, some of our ideas, and some of our suggestions on how to decide for yourself whether or not you're using elemental overload or scaling your critical strike multiplier. But what about for you? Drop us a comment and let us know what type of build you're playing and how you're scaling your damage, whether that's via crit or via elemental overload. Thanks again for watching, and once again, shout out and thanks so much to all of our Patreon supporters who make all this happen. Thanks for watching that video. If you'd like more information on any of our discussion points today, you can see them down below in the video description. If you'd also like to join our Discord or support our Patreon, you can do so with the links down below. Thanks again, and big shout out to all of our Patreon supporters.